Ready to proceed, Councillor Chapman.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So if we can start with apologies for absence.
Chair, we have apologies from Councillor Renison and Hayhurst and Henry Colthurst.
Okay, voted. Thanks very much. Are there any declarations of interests from members? I don't hear any. Okay, so no new ones anyway. Can we consider the minutes of the previous meeting? I won't plan to go through them page by page, but is there anybody who wishes to raise a correction? I don't hear anyone, so can we agree those as a true record?
Yeah, agreed.
Agreed.
Okay. So the quarterly update report. Who's going to do that then?
I'm happy to.
Can I just ask that we assume that members had the opportunity to read these? Obviously, all these reports are detailed, so there will be questions. But I think in doing introductions, except when obviously there's some issues, we need to go in more detail on the investment strategy stuff. We do assume that members have read the report, so we don't need to go through things again in detail. But,
yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So obviously taking the chair's point into account there, I suppose the key item that I'd like to raise from the quarterly report is really to look at the section on pensions administration. So clearly that sets out administration issues during the quarter from, make sure I get the date right, March through to June. But what I did want to draw everybody's attention to is just to provide a bit of an update on the status of the fund's annual benefit statements. As clearly those were due out on the 31st of August. For a number of reasons, we have had some delays in sending out the statements, but we are now able to provide as soon as I can find the right section of this update. I can give you a more comprehensive update of the numbers that have now been sent. So obviously the statements are split into active and deferred benefit statements. So the position that we're in on the actives is that as of the end of August, so approaching the deadline, we'd sent out just over 4,000 annual benefit statements, and there's around 2,300 yet to be issued. So of those 2,300, we're looking at about 1,800 had queries that need to be checked or had outstanding employer data. And what I'm pleased to say is that those queries have now been resolved, and the statements will be sent on the 7th of October. So that leaves us with around 500 cases that are either being investigated or have data outstanding. So in terms of the deferred statements, we've issued just over 7,500 by the deadline. We have around 1,200 that we cannot issue because we don't have an up-to-date address for the member, and then we have around 150 that have been held back as they need further investigation. So what we have done is, now that we have this update, we have now made a report to the pensions regulator that this is the case. It does represent, unfortunately, it's a slight worsening of performance relative to last year, which is a shame. I think essentially the position that we've been in is we have had. We have received data from employers that is relatively timely. Quite a large proportion, we did have quite a large proportion of errors or data requiring validation. But what we've also seen is some delays at Affinity's end. So obviously there have been repercussions from the COVID-19 pandemic, and and also we have Equinity have seen a certain amount of staff illness themselves, and have struggled a little bit on that front. So essentially, I'd regard it is slightly disappointing that we have slipped back a little bit on where we were last year, as we have made an awful lot of progress in issuing statements on time. But I'd emphasise that we did get the majority of statements did go out by the deadline, and we now have relatively few outstanding, except for those that are missing an address, which are a longer term problem that will need to be dealt with proper address tracing. So it's really just to note if there's any additional questions around around administration or around issuing benefit statements.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can pick up most of the fund performance issues in the discussion on the strategy, I guess.
I mean, I'm happy to cover fund performance either now or as part of the strategy.
I don't think there's much need to say in addition to the report. Just we ought to note that fund, given the caveats about the significance of the funding level, that we're at reporting assets of around 1.7 billion and a funding level of 88.2%. Just note that.
So we have seen a significant bounce back in the funding level, but I suppose what I would caution is obviously markets have been very volatile. They have been behaving in a manner that does look perhaps slightly divorced from what's happening in sort of the wider economy. So,
can I ask Rachel?
Yes.
Firstly,
yes. Sorry, Michael. Of course. Yeah.
I think 88.2% is very good, but it is, of course, 3 months out of date. Have we got a sort of approximation of the percentage at the end of September, or are we unsure of that?
I can't give you one for the very end of September. The last one I had was around a week ago, which was fairly similar, I think, to the end.
I mean, given what's happened, I think that's very creditable and something you should tell your newborn baby is a great credit to Hackney and to the pension.
As I said, I would at present, I would not regard the current funding level as particularly as evidence of sort of the longer term robust performance at this stage. As I think we're still.
No, I think it's
comparatively very early in sort of working through the effects of COVID-19. So essentially, it's an estimate. It's a snapshot in time.
Sure.
And certainly, I wouldn't regard it as representing a particularly robust trend at this point.
No, I realise. Now, the other question I had is more specific on the asset allocation. Which I don't know what page it's on. There's something that's a bit strange. We agreed on Churchill senior loans and Permira senior loans. If you look down the valuations for Permira senior loans, quarter one it says 14 million, and quarter two it's more than doubled to 30.9 million. Is there any explanation for that at all?
Yes, there is. So essentially, both the Churchill and Permira allocations are very, very early on in their lifespan, and the way these allocations are funded is that we don't fund them all at once. Essentially, what happens is that the managers will request drawdowns of capital over time. So what you've seen, particularly with Permira recently, is it took quite a long time between the decision to invest and the first request for capital. But since receiving that first request for capital in the last financial year, Permira have actually made another. I think they've now made 5 drawdown requests in total. So what you've seen isn't a reflection, of performance.
No.
It's a reflection of increased capital going into the mandate.
Okay, that explains that. That's fine.
So essentially, under normal economic conditions, I think we'd expect them to be fully funded within a couple of years, potentially a little bit. We'd have thought a little bit longer given the current situation, but actually, particularly Permira have continued to make drawdown requests during since March. So it is being funded a little bit faster than I'd anticipated.
Okay.
Okay, are there any? Oh, sorry, apologies. Are there any other questions? I was going to raise the admin stuff, but yeah, can I do that then? So yeah, you've gone through the issue we had with the late issuing of statements, and I'm glad to hear we're catching up on that. But I noticed also that the performance figures for Equinity are aren't very good really. On where were they? They were on page. Depends when you're looking on the PDF or the paper one. It's page 11 on the paper one and page 19 on the on the PDF. But it does look like there's sort of a bit of a rocky performance and admin all round at the moment, isn't there?
So there has been a decline.
Well, can I just add? Sorry, I was particularly surprised because I mean a lot of it seems to be around COVID-19 issues, but I just say I didn't really pick up that sense there was a developing problem there from the reports we had previously about the COVID situation. So sorry, yeah.
No, that's okay. To a certain extent, I think there have been issues. There have been issues around COVID-19. What I would say is that essentially over the year, what you have seen is with the introduction of the new administration contract, we have moved to a new reporting regime. So I think there is an element of that reduction that reflects, I think, more robust reporting, which is something that I know Julie pushed very, very hard for to get from Equinity. Yeah. So I think there's a certain element in there that partially reflects better reporting. I do think it's something that that does merit investigation, as there clearly has been a drop. But again, what I would say is that the new contract very much supports doing that additional investigation work and having a much clearer picture as to what proportion of targets are actually being met. So I suspect it's a combination of both. I think we have to a certain extent seen a decline in performance, but also that the reporting regime is now much better than it has been previously, which I think is a positive development in terms of actually pushing standards up.
Cam?
Yes, good evening, everybody. My question is on McLeod Remedy. How badly are we going to be affected with that? Because I read somewhere that it's going to present a significant administrative burden for the LGPS. So how significant is it going to be for us, in terms of cost or administrative burden?
So I think there's a couple of different components of it to consider. I mean, first of all, there's the impact that the impact that the remedy itself is going to have on the fund's liabilities. So at the moment, we don't have a precise estimate of what that overall impact on the liabilities is going to be. It's something that's been factored into the funding strategy statement by requiring a greater likelihood that the fund will achieve its desired funding position. But what we haven't done is to put an estimated number on that. What we do have is a project running at the moment, which Karen and Aon have worked very hard on to set up a McLeod project plan for us to get that underway. And so, what we will be doing in the near future is looking at that estimate of the impact on liabilities. The other side, as you've mentioned, of it is that it is going to represent an administrative burden for both the Hackney Fund and other public sector schemes for essentially a number of years to come. And again, I think part of the project is going to be to a certain extent is going to be quantifying that and saying what's the impact on our administration processes. Essentially, our belief at the moment is that there certainly will be an impact in terms of the liabilities and in terms of administration. What I can say is that we have the council's accounts previously made an assumption around McLeod, and we believe that the overall impact will now be less than that. But beyond that, unfortunately, I don't have a more detailed figure to put to it. I would hope, but I would hope by the time of the next committee, I think it's likely we would have an early estimate in place.
Chairman, can I come in on the back of Rachel, if that's okay? You're on mute, Chairman.
Unmute. At least I've learned not to eject myself from the meeting when I come off mute. Karen, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So as Rachel mentioned, the impact on the fund's liabilities really is a bit uncertain at this point in time, albeit an estimate has been included at the last valuation. However, what I can say is based on work with other funds, we have actually found that on average about 25% of the fund's records need to be looked at, updated, and potentially then some recalculations done. So it is a really massive amount of work that needs carried out. However, particularly in that initial few years, we expect very few people to actually have an increase in their benefits because the care scheme is actually quite a generous scheme. So unfortunately, because of the age discrimination element, it feels very much like an awful lot of work with not a lot of impact actually on the scheme members. So it will really need to be properly communicated to scheme members so they don't get their hopes up high. As we go through time, there will be more people that are actually impacted by the protection, but in the short term, it won't actually be that many.
So we're heading for a GMP Mark 2, are we?
I would actually say GMP doubled or tripled is actually it's an awful lot of work. Yeah.
Actually, that's quite worrying, really, because the GMP exercises prove quite expensive to resolve, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the difficulty here as well is the impact on employers. So, and I particularly highlight it will put a lot of strain on employers such as Hackney Council themselves to provide data to Equinity so that they can update their records to do the revised calculation. So it's not just a strain on Equinity and the pension team, it is a strain on the employers as well that we'll need to manage.
Yep, I think just in addition to what Karen's mentioned as well around the employers, I mean, what there is also the potential for, because we do have some quite small employers, there is the potential for some employers to see a disproportionate impact from the remedy. I mean, looking at the profile of a lot of our employers, I would hope that wouldn't be the case, but it is a possibility, as we do have some fairly small ones who could be impacted quite significantly by changes to quite small numbers of members.
Okay, right. Any other questions? Can I? Yes. So we just for that, I think we need to pick up on the admin issues because I think the thing is when we're all focused on the great strategic things like investment strategy, it's important. We also focus on admin and just running the scheme. And obviously there are a number of issues that are developing which could be quite troublesome. So I think we probably better have a report on it next time. I mean, you might feature it slightly more fully in the update, but it's probably worth considering as a separate issue. Don't know what you think. I don't know.
I think I agree about that. I'd agree with that, Councillor Chapman, and we'll work to bring that forward. And if it's necessary, given there's a while till the next committee, we could do an update with you and members in advance of that.
Okay, that would be helpful, and we could either do a sort of quick video update, or you could update me, and we'll do an email round and offer people the opportunity to ask questions. Okay, then can we note that report then?
Noted.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Item 5, staffing arrangements, and Ian's going to, following on from our announcement earlier, Ian is going to tell us what's going on. Yeah.
Great stuff. So, as you'll all be aware that today was meant to be Michael's last day, and he was due to retire from the council from his current role as Director of Financial Management. But and I'm using these words a lot because, and actually, I genuinely mean them. I'm absolutely delighted to announce that Michael's agreed to stay on and cover Rachel's.
Oh, well done! Thank you so much.
It is something that I'm particularly grateful for. We did look to see if alternatives in the market existed, and frankly, nothing compared to what Michael will bring to the team. And some of the prices that we were being quoted for interims were just frankly eye-watering. So I'm delighted that Michael's taken up the offer, and really look forward to continue to work with him, as I'm sure everyone on this committee does. So thank you very much.
Excellent.
Yeah, so we should know also that Julie Stacey's moved on as well. Yeah.
Ah, yes, of course. Sorry, Chair. I lose track of when we do all the committees, but yes, absolutely. Julie Stacey has been a long-term member of the Hackney Finance team, in particular in the pensions admin team. She also has retired very recently, about a month or two ago. Julie's been instrumental in a lot of the improvements that we've seen, and I'm sure everyone will join me in wishing her a long and happy retirement. Michael and Julian and Rachel and myself have been working over many months following the council's voluntary redundancy scheme concluding to restructure the pensions team, bringing together pension admin, and that's what we're continuing to work towards. Obviously, a lot of that is already well progressed, and certainly Michael and I will make sure that and land us with a robust, sustainable and resilient function going forward.
Yeah, I also understand we've got a new Director of Finance who may or may not we be seeing at committees in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. So yes, I'm also delighted to announce that Jackie Moylan, who's currently Director of Finance within Children's and Adults and Community Health, has agreed to step across to take on Michael's role on the interim basis, whilst I take a further look at the whole finance support function on the back of the Chief Executive's restructure of the council. A number of you will work closely with Jackie, I'm sure. I'm just looking at the members on the committee here today. Certainly Councillor Adams will have encountered Jackie in the work that she's led on in relation to the Britannia scheme. Jackie's been with us for over a decade, very highly regarded, very capable officer, and again, she will supplement the resources that we have at this committee, and look forward to working with her, as does Michael and Rachel.
Excellent. I just going to say, because I know when I first became chair of this committee, which wasn't that long ago actually, we had obviously Jill Davis and Rachel and Julie, so there's three officers there, and we've now got temporarily anyway Michael part-time. It strikes me that there may be necessary to get other support at points, and I just wondered if you've got any comments on that, because obviously
Absolutely.
I really appreciate Michael staying on a bit longer and helping us, but we don't want to run him ragged in his 2 months.
So, as I sort of alluded to in a way, and Michael probably wants to come in a moment, on the back of various redundancies going forwards, what we'd look to do is bring forward a revised structure for the whole treasury and the whole pensions admin and pension investment team, and actually that will look to bring in and have in place the administrative resources to supplement the role of head of that team ultimately, which is Rachel's job. I don't know, Michael, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to. So as part of me leaving, it was definitely a part of the agreement with me leaving was to try and sort out the structure that would follow me. So we've certainly done some work around the financial services division, which includes pensions, etc. But we also recognise that going forward, at least in the interim, until we get back to the normal state, we may need a little bit more support on things like the cloud, etc. We've arranged for some support from, for example, from Aon for project management, which will help us to make sure that we've got the capacity to actually make sure they're delivered successfully. So I'm confident that we can manage this, and it's been obvious in our process over the last 6 to 7 months to make sure that we've got a suitable structure going forward.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, that's reassuring. But I think the committee is interested, obviously interested in to the appropriate level in whatever structure comes out. I I don't think it's not appropriate for us to get into HR matters and the detail of it, but I think it'd be useful if we were involved in understanding what services we'd be provided with in future, if you know what I mean. I think I can speak for everyone in saying we remain open to requests for additional resources to support Michael and the team in terms of short-term consultancies and things like that if it becomes necessary, or it's helpful.
Absolutely, Chair. Absolutely.
And I suppose it's odd, really. Obviously, I think the committee should record its thanks and best wishes to Julie for leaving. I'm not sure what on her retirement, right? I'm not sure, as we have done for Rachel, which should be in the notes, I think, but in an appropriate way. And we should also do it for Michael, really. But I'm not, since he's come in one door, well, not even come in one, and it's a revolving door almost, isn't it? It's actually left the building. But since he's formally retiring from his substantive role today, I think we should know our great thanks to him over many years in his great support to the council as a whole and us as a pensions committee, and wish him thank him for that and wish him well for his retirement if it ever happens. when it happens.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's great. Okay, so with that, if we can move. I suppose if the committee happy to agree those sentiments?
Yeah, we
agree.
agree.
So then if we can move to investment strategy and training, and this is the sort of main item for tonight. I'm going to hand over to Hymans and the advisors and Rachel to do this and sort of facilitate our way through it all, because there's an awful lot of disparate documents here, some of which are clearer than others, but they'll all be revealed. And it'd be helpful if you could start off just by putting tonight's exercise in context with the other exercises we've been doing and how we plan to round it all off. Yep, set the scene. Okay, so over to who's going to start? Rachel is muted.
Sorry about that. I'm happy to put the paper in. I'm happy to introduce the paper and put it into context, and then I will pass over to Andrew to talk through some of the more detailed modelling aspects, if that's okay.
Great, and I guess given the nature of the papers, Andrew, particularly happy to be interrupted at any point if there's questions. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, I think the only other thing I do have to note before we start is that the paper itself is on the public agenda, but we do have the final two appendices, which includes the modelling covered on the exempt agenda. So it's just.
Can someone clarify that? But the agenda I got, there's nothing on it on the private agenda. So can we be absolutely clear? Which appendix? It's the two appendices. Go on, tell me which appendix numbers they are.
So it's Appendix 2 and Appendix 2 and Appendix 3 are exempt, and so with particular reference to Appendix 2 is in a presentation format, which
okay. Can you show me then at the point when we have to exclude the press and public, although it's probably a theoretical point at this time?
It's just to note from the point of view of the live streaming, as we'd like to screen share the presentation. So it's just pointing out that is an exempt appendix.
Okay. At the point we get to the point where I have to formally exclude the press and public, could someone tell me what that point is?
I will tell you when that is.
I can't tell from my papers. Well,
all right, apologies for that.
Numbers, but you know what I mean, don't you?
Yes.
What I mean is they're not pink.
So no, that's fine. Essentially, the aim of this paper is really to present a high level framework for developing the fund's investment strategy, and essentially what it's doing is during the previous workshop and committee, we focused very much on investment beliefs. This takes that forward and essentially adds in consideration of different asset types. So what you'll notice is that the focus of the paper is slightly different to the previous meeting. So the previous workshop and committee meeting focused very much on responsible investment and on developing a set of very, very high level investment beliefs for the fund. And those are set out at Appendix 1. And one of the recommendations here is to approve those high level beliefs. But the key element of this paper is really that it looks at a slightly different aspect, in that it looks at the economic drivers of return for the fund, and it tries to focus on the types of asset that can provide the fund with that return. So rather than looking necessarily at the beliefs of the committee, it's looking at a very, very high level. It's looking at the types of assets that are available to the committee that are available to the committee for the fund to invest in, and essentially the qualities of those assets, what they can bring to the fund in different economic circumstances. So it sets out 3 asset types: growth, income, and protection. So we're not even looking, it's not looking at the detail of, say, equities, bonds, property. We're looking a level higher than that to try to see what the return drivers are, and how the fund could benefit or otherwise from each type of asset. So I think it's worth pointing out that it's not the end point of developing the strategy. And what we'd like to do is at a future workshop, and then at the next formal meeting in January, will be more about bringing the different elements together. So looking at the fund's specific asset allocation and trying to incorporate both what we've discussed around the different asset types, but also the committee's own beliefs around what the fund should invest in, to look at a more detailed asset allocation for the fund, so we can start to answer some of those more detailed questions. So essentially, it's to try to clarify this is a sort of intermediate stage. And at a future workshop and at the next committee, what you should start to see is that what's being discussed starts to look a lot closer to, say, the fund's current asset allocation, and how that might be changed over the next 3 years, and which parts of it might stay the same. So the way this modeling's been done is that it uses asset liability modelling, which is something that you've encountered as part of the valuation. So it takes a number of different scenarios and models those a huge number of times, looking at different economic scenarios, and looks at how those different asset types might perform in those different scenarios. So it's at this point I'd suggest that we start to work through the presentation. I will hand over to Andrew, and just to note that at this point could we move to an exempt session, if that's okay.
You're on mute, Rob.
It's going to be like this all night, isn't it?
Yes, we need Mario just to take us off the live.
I've excluded myself already. Yeah. Can I move to the exclusion of the press and public as set out in the resolution on the agenda?
Agreed.
Agreed. Right, and now can I ask, just before we go to Andrew, is any questions to Rachel on the context of what we're doing now and how it fits into the whole process? Okay. So, well, obviously you raise them as you can.
essentially the requirement at the moment is that the pension fund accounts form part of the council's statement of accounts. That may change in the future, but as the essentially current statutory requirement is that it does go with the council's main accounts, and that goes to audit committee.
So that's why the recommendation just asks us to note it.
Yes, that is why it is slightly oddly worded in the sense that the audit committee has already seen and approved the statement of accounts section of the pension fund report and accounts.
Am I right in saying that there's still some opportunity to what's the word, sharpen up or change the report bit if it's appropriate to do so?
Yeah, so to a certain extent, there is essentially the auditor's requirement.
Well, not the numbers, obviously.
Yes, you can't change that. That's the key point. You can't change the numbers, and you can't change any numbers within the report that are within the statement of accounts must be the same as those within the statement of accounts. So you can't change the numbers, but obviously changes to say the foreword are absolutely welcome. With a note that we do need to give the auditors sufficient time to read the completed document, and publication date is the 30th of November.
Okay, so if anyone's got any views on that or things, the forward, I hadn't actually seen the forward until the agenda appeared, so I'm going to. It's fine, but I'm going to refine it a little bit. So if anyone's got any views on what they need to add, or if there's anything they want to add, or things they think we've got wrong, please submit it to Michael, I guess. Yeah, I've got Rachel over there, and we'll pick that up. But apart from that, then, can we then let's get the recommendations to note the report, isn't it? Let's see and approve publication.
Noted and approved. Yeah.
Noted and
approved.
Noted and approved. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's actually everything you want to know about the pension committee, the pension fund is in there. So it's really, I find it a really useful document. How many members we've got, what we're invested in, all sorts of things. So it's apart from anything else, it is actually a very useful document. Okay, then if we can move on to the business plan, which is item 8. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, what the business plan presents is essentially it's a medium term look at the funds plans. So it covers the period. Essentially, every year we update this on a rolling basis. So we update it each year, but it covers the next 3 years of the fund's activities. And essentially, what it tries to do is focus on focus for each area of the fund. So looking across investment, governance, and administration, it tries to cover the key areas that we'll focus on, and also some of the key items in terms of the operating budget. So it does look at items like the GMP reconciliation, like the McLeod project. It tries to focus on items that will essentially take up time and budget. So it's not looking to detail sort of every regular activity we do over the year. Instead, it's trying to look across the next 3 years, look at what's coming down the line, in terms of sort of individual events, and try to put a timeline on the next 3 years and try to identify what we're really going to be focusing on outside of business as usual activities. So essentially, any questions on it are welcome.
Well, I was going to say, could you just lay out what the main changes are in it, which are, not in great detail, but you just the main thing that's. Yep. Oh, I know the answer to this, but go on.
So to be honest, there's been quite a few changes, partly to the format of the business plan.
Yeah.
So this is a more detailed plan.
Yeah.
Than we used to, and then obviously there are there are a number of changes to timescales on here. So on our previous business plan, despite the change in format, we included a number of the items that we've got here. What we have seen is quite a significant shift in timetabling on some items, and some of that's a result of sort of COVID-19 and everybody adjusting to working from home. Some of that's been the result of, as you can tell, we are in the middle of some quite significant staff changes. But others are simply the fact that, despite the pandemic, we are still seeing sort of changes coming through. We are seeing changes coming through for the LGPS. So there's items on there that are new. There's items on there that perhaps we now have a better grasp of timescale and what's required. So a particular example there might be McLeod. So at the time of looking at this last year, we were aware of the McLeod judgment, but obviously there's significantly more detail available around that now. There is a remedy being consulted on, so we have a much better idea of what the timescales are. So essentially, there are a lot of changes on there, but that's largely a function of being a year further down the line and seeing some of the individual areas clarified, and understanding more about what's likely to come out of the next 3 years.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks very much. What often gets attention is the issues of timescales for provision of information from other employers and penalties that are involved, for non-compliance with those, aren't there?
So we don't really cover business as usual activities on this business plan, because essentially those are activities that we need to specifically timetable them, simply because they happen regularly each year to the same timetable. So provision of information by employers each year, or rather, each month, we have a statutory monthly deadline for provision of information, and we have an annual deadline for provision of information. Were those deadlines to change, and we were to need to change processes, we would look to put that into the business plan. Yeah. As there's no change to that timetable, we wouldn't necessarily cover it here. The types of we do cover, though, are it is things like development of the pensions data service, as that represents a change to what we need to do as a fund.
Okay then. Any questions or comments on this?
Yeah, Chair, just a comment. I'm just wondering, will there be any opportunity to review the business plan in a situation whereby we have unforeseen situation, like for example, like COVID? Nobody planned for COVID,
Yep, I think that essentially we review it every year, but yes, I think if we were to have another really significant upheaval, then yes, we would look to revise it. It isn't intended to be something that's set in stone, because obviously, unexpected things can and do happen. None of us anticipated, sort of, at the start of 2020, that we would be conducting all of our work from home.
Okay, then. Any other? Sorry, Rachel. Sorry, has you finished, Rachel?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Can we approve the pensions admin strategy then? Yeah. You'll have noticed I did those two items in the swap the order of them. It looked like you're all following what was going on, so I didn't stop. All right.
Sorry, have I just?
When you're balancing lots of tiny, electronic copies and all sorts of things all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, because this agenda item is 9 on the paper.
Yeah, no, we're now on 9.
Yeah, no, but now on my paper it says agenda item 9 is business plan.
Yeah, that's right. That's where we are.
Okay.
It's okay. So business plan, Rachel.
Yeah.
Sorry, apologies. I've got slightly confused. So that was which is my fault. I've just covered the business plan. I am happy to come back to the administration strategy.
I also thought we were discussing the business plan and was looking at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, sorry, that
I think we have approved the business plan.
yes.
Right.
Probably not.
That was my fault for missing out the administration strategy.
We skipped the administration strategy, which we need to go back to. Yeah.
We'll do that. Well, okay, go on item 9 in the business plan. The thing we had discussion earlier, and going back to the ESG points that were raised, the thing that should be, we should feature the implementation of the stewardship code in the business plan. Yeah, but I wonder if we can incorporate that.
I'd be happy to.
Things like
We've covered but not specifically implementation of the stewardship code, so we can definitely add that in.
We should add that in if that's all right. Okay. Subject to that, then, are we happy to agree the business plan? Okay.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the administration strategy.
That's agenda item 7.
Yep. Apologies for that. I was doing so well till then, I thought, but never mind. You all probably differ. Rachel, the administration strategy then.
Yes, no, happy to cover it. So in terms of the administration strategy, clear what this sets out is essentially it covers the requirements of both employers in the fund and the fund itself and its third-party administrator in relation to administration. Essentially, it's a rule book for us all to follow, and it sets out essentially a set of performance standards that both employers, the fund, and the third party administrator need to adhere to. It is quite long. It sets out a number of quite detailed provisions. I suppose what the key point that I'd note in terms of changes is that the fund is introducing a new online employer portal, employer self-service. So that's starting to be rolled out from sort of latest year. If we can sort of manage around home working and manage to keep communication up with employers, that would be mandatory from April 2021. So what the current admin strategy does is make provision for employer self-service to be introduced. So that's the key change from last year's strategy.
Sorry, any questions or comments on that? I think just raise the thing about the whole issue about time limits, the one I asked a minute ago, time limits and penalties. He's quite controversial sometimes. How is that going to be impacted by the potential changes with the portal? Would that should make it easier for them to report, shouldn't it?
It should make it easier for employers to report. Obviously, we do need to maintain a penalty system in place for employers who do not comply. As we do need to have some recourse. Where employers are not providing information, or more seriously, not providing contributions on time, there does need to be some means of trying to encourage compliance, and a system of charges for additional administration time is one way of doing that. I think you're on mute, Chair.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments on that?
I think in relation to what we heard earlier about the anxieties we've got on administration, recommendations are apposite, and I think we should endorse them.
Okay. Shall we do that then? Agreed?
Agreed.
Right, okay, so that's then being very careful this time. We are on the pension fund budget, item 10.
Sorry, just make sure I'm off mute. So this presents at a admittedly slightly odd time of year. We would normally look to bring this to committee in June, but owing to cancellation in March, we've had a few things reshuffled. So we are slightly oddly halfway through the year concerned. But essentially, this sets out the proposed budget for the year 2021, and essentially what it covers is the main cash flow items for the fund. So it looks at our dealings with employers. It looks at our operating expenditure, so issues such as administration, oversight and governance, and investment costs. And then it looks at what we might hope to raise in terms of investment income. And it does link to it does, you know, if you look at the budget itself, it does link to the element we discussed earlier around the increased maturity of the fund. Because what you can clearly see looking at the budget is that we did see a very significant shift in our cash flow position during 2019-20. We don't believe that all of that experience will be repeated. So essentially what we saw last year was a very significant decrease in our net additions from dealing with members. So we've gone from a position of very strong cash flow positivity there to a much reduced position. We're still cash flow positive, but less so. And the key driver of that was an increase in pensions paid. Part of that reflected an inflationary increase. Part of that reflected we did have a large number of retirements in year, so we did see an increase in the number of pensioners. The really key item is because of the very large and because of the exceptional number of retirements we saw last year, we paid out a very large sum in lump sum commutations. So one advantage of that is that it will, in going forward, that those commutations are now pensions that we don't have to pay because the lump sum has been paid out. However, that it will in the longer term be reflected in a larger number of pensioners, but they are the lump sum commutations. They are one-off cash payments. The position that we've reached in the budget is to suggest that could be maintained. That's looking on the cautious side. I would most likely expect the number of retirements to decrease a little bit, simply because last year's was so unusually high. But it's not something that we can guarantee. So something that's worth bearing in mind is that a lot of these are difficult to forecast because they do rely very heavily on member behaviour. So what we saw last year was quite an exceptional circumstance relative to previous years. What I think we'd expect to see is, simply by the law of averages, a slight normalisation in the following year. But again, it is very difficult to predict. So the elements of these cash flows that we can predict are things like pay rises and inflationary increases. So those elements have a degree of predictability. We know that Hackney's pay rise for this year is 2.75%, and we know that the inflationary increase on pensions will be 1.7%, which is quite a bit lower than last year. The parts that we cannot predict are how our members behave and what they do. So we can't predict transfers in, transfers out. We can't really predict the number of retirements. So some of them are quite uncertain. I would expect us to revert a little bit towards cash flow positivity relative to last year. But given the changes we're on lines that are very, very challenging to predict, it's not something that we can say with certainty. So that's the reason behind the very steep decline. Other costs, what we've generally seen is sort of within the bounds of what we'd expect. So we did last year see a slight increase in our management costs. A large part of that attributable to investment management, partly again, each year we are improving our reporting of investment management expenses, so we do tend to see increases. We are now invested in slightly more expensive asset classes relative to where we were, say, 2 or 3 years ago. And also, exceptionally this year, we were required to actually make assumptions around our investment management expenses. So the actual cash flows associated with these actually are likely to turn out to be less, and that is simply because of uncertainty over asset values at year end, which was essentially entirely associated with COVID-19. So we don't expect some of these to repeat next year.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is quite prudent.
I would hope.
Yeah, nodded then.
I would hope that it is. We've certainly taken a cautious approach to lump sum commutations and assumed that the position this year will remain the same as last year, even though last year's was quite exceptionally high. It's prudent where we've got a degree of predictability. We have tried to include a degree of prudence. Obviously, for a lot of these, we cannot make reliable estimates and have to acknowledge that. So it's very much a case of, in 3 months' time, picking this up again for budget monitoring, looking at how closely aligned some of these are, and potentially we will then revise forecasts accordingly.
Okay, that's it. The only observation I would make is that previously the budget figures do move around a lot because of all those issues that you've said before. But going forward, we are going to have to be much more careful with it because of those cash flow pressures that you mentioned. And I know there's an item in the work programme, isn't there, about looking at cash flow monitoring in that way. And I think the committee needs to be give this more attention than perhaps it has done in the past. We've just noted in the past, we're cash flow positive, great, but it does need closer monitoring in the future, I think.
Yeah, it's a case of, I think, increasing its prominence at the committee, of looking in more detail on a monthly basis where we are with some of the essentially trying to break down some of our member cash flows so that we can potentially try to make more accurate predictions. Yeah. So, for example, lump sum commutations. One thing we can do is, obviously we have access to a lot of information around the council's employees. So the type of exercise we could look to do is actually start looking at that information and make more detailed assumptions around, okay, how many people do we think will hit retirement age in the next year, and that then gives us a bit more of a forward look at some of these member behaviours.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments from anybody? Can we? What we asked to do? Approve it? Are we? Yep.
Yes.
Can we approve the budget?
Approved. Okay,
then it comes to item 11, pension fund treasury strategy. Okay, yeah, the only comment I had on that, I'll do it before you start, is that I did question whether you can or cannot delegate responsibility. But anyway, if you want to introduce the report. But
yeah, that's fine. I think we've agreed that that can read delegate authority. If you know, on the grounds that you cannot delegate responsibility, but authority can be delegated.
Okay, and as I understand it, this describes the way that officers will deal with our cash, basically, look after it.
Yes.
So, I mean, have any members got any questions? Sorry, Rachel.
No, that's okay. It was just to point out that the key change to this is really just to note that as a result of the changes we've made for asset pooling, we have slightly changed sort of the purpose of cash held with our custodian. Essentially, we now have a much reduced requirement for full custody assets, as we don't have so many segregated mandates. So essentially, HSBC now hold cash on our behalf for one reason only, which is to allow the bond manager to meet derivative margin calls. Whereas previously they used to also hold it for some of our equity strategies as well, although that's now no longer the case.
Okay then, any questions or comments on this paper? Can we agree the recommendations? Agreed. Okay. I haven't been notified of any other business, but I would ask. Our next committee is due in January, isn't it? And we're going to plan a workshop to finish off the investment strategy before then. Is my understanding where we go next year. Can I just ask that we do set a date for that as soon as possible, even if it's a while ahead, so give a chance to members planning, because while it has been really difficult this year, obviously in terms of the COVID issues and other stuff, it'd be good to have some clarity on when that meeting is as soon as possible.
I'll look at dates over the next couple of weeks and get them out.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we'll have a chat about that when you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay then, so I think just to reiterate our congratulations to Rachel, and our thanks and best wishes to Judy, Stacey and Michael, although we're seeing him back next week. But and then thank you all very much for your attendance. See you soon.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.